Hey guys, Dave with First Place Auto Parts, and I've been a NASCAR fan for a long time. Look, my zenith for NASCAR for me was in the mid to early 80s when Bill Elliott, Dale Waltrip, and Dale Earnhardt, man, they were tearing up the tracks with the Monte Carlos and the Ford Thunderbirds. But NASCAR has come a long way from its humble beginnings, and what really is interesting to me is not only the technological change, but also how the tracks have changed. When the first race was, when NASCAR became a sanctioning body, and how it's progressed over the decades. And in today's video, what we're going to do is we're just going to touch lightly on that, just so we get a better understanding. Look, it's easy to look at NASCAR today, and it's a very refined process, and there the cars really all look the same. It's almost spec racing, but it wasn't always the case. And in today's video, we're going to take a look at the history of NASCAR, where it started, and how it got here. So guys, stay tuned. Today we're talking NASCAR, a little bit of those backwoods history. Now today, NASCAR is one of the most viewed television events, sporting events, just second to football only, but that wasn't always the case. Look, NASCAR started off in the South with Moonshiners. Look, these guys were used to run 120 miles an hour on the backcountry dirt roads, red clay roads of Georgia, hauling moonshine. They developed not only fast cars, but a real talent for driving, and from that came organized racing. Now, thanks to some unscrupulous promoters that oftentimes would take all the money and run, it left a lot of angry guys. And in 1935, Bill France moved to Florida, Daytona Beach, Florida, to escape the Great Depression. And he is what we consider to be the founder, the originator of the organization we know as NASCAR. Now, the very first NASCAR race, it was held, as you probably know, on Daytona Beach. It was a crazy race, a lot of stock vehicles, a lot of them ended up not finishing. But in 1948, on February 15th, the very first NASCAR race, or what we consider to be the first NASCAR race, was held. Look, NASCAR wasn't an organization yet, but that would change a week later on the 21st of February in 48 when Bill France incorporated what we now know as NASCAR. And look, there needed to be some organization that provided some rules and some sort of a formal setup to the racing, because the first race, it was nothing short of bedlam and mayhem. And even though Red Byron won it, it could have meant anybody's win or anybody's loss. Now, up until this point in time, for that year, that first year of NASCAR, there were multiple classes of vehicles that could run. But on June 19th, 1949, that is recognized as the very first official strictly stock NASCAR race held at Charlotte Speedway, of which there were 33 contestants, and the only modifications was some sort of a metal shield that you could put over there near the right front tire to keep from cutting it down. But it was a well-attended event, and it was considered the first strictly stock car race organized by NASCAR. And it was at the Charlotte race where 13,000 people watched the race. Glenn Dunaway was announced the winner until a week later when it was found out that his rear suspension had modifications. Look, this would be a theme of NASCAR, and a lot of crew chiefs got really good at making modifications that skirted the NASCAR rule book, such as Smokey Yunick. Everybody wanted to go faster, and NASCAR developed tracks that made that possible as it went along in its history. And from that simple race in Charlotte with those 13,000 attendees, Bill France Sr. knew he had something special. And what they wanted to do is he wanted to grow this thing. They wanted to attract more people. And that's when the first, what we consider to be modern speedway, was built near Darlington in 1950. And then it wasn't until 1959, NASCAR went through that whole era of the 50s, assembling short tracks to apply its trade. Look, it raced on both dirt and pavement, but in 1959, Bill France Sr., Big Bill as he was known, built the Daytona Speedway, and this was really important. No longer were we racing in backwoods, country dirt tracks, or on the beach at Daytona Beach. We had a super speedway that was paved and banked, most importantly. And in 1959, the first Daytona 500 was held, and it drew a huge crowd. In the 1960s, it showed a huge expansion in NASCAR, and there were a lot of tracks that were just infamous, like Dover, Michigan, Talladega, Alabama, which the Talladega Super Speedway, which was built in 1969, some consider it to be the fastest oval in the world, were all brought online for NASCAR racing in the 1960s. The events continued to grow, the number of races continued to grow, and so did the audience base. And if there's a decade where NASCAR really flourished, almost like a coming out party, it's when it partnered with Reynolds Tobacco in the 70s. Look, this not only brought mainstream recognition, not just in the South, but all over the country, but it also made it very high profile and it brought on a lot of new sponsors like Kellogg's to the series. As a matter of fact, Tobacco Reynolds owned the Winston cigarette brand, or made those cigarettes, and the Winston Cup came to us in regards to the winner of the championship. They sponsored the whole series. Look, the first Daytona 500 live televised was during the 70s, and from there it just took off. People realized not only did they like racing in the South, but people all over the country liked racing. They liked the personalities, they liked the action. When the Indianapolis Speedway in the 1990s came on the map in regards to a race, look, that's a legendary track, and for NASCAR to race on that track, it meant a lot to the sport. It took it not just beyond a local type of a televised broadcast, but it made it an internationally broadcasted race. It drew a lot of interest, just like the Indy 500 did. So in the 80s and the 90s, NASCAR continued to grow, but it also started to refine itself into something that started to become a little less personable and a little more corporate. And that's where the changes really started to take place, especially in the 90s. The drivers themselves weren't quite as colorful, and the cars all started to look the same as well. So the 80s and the 90s, while it wasn't stagnant for NASCAR, there was a lot of change that came before. Some of it was necessary to help make the sport safer, but some of it changed it forever, maybe not for the better in the case of a lot of people's minds, but you can't argue with the attendance and also the viewership. NASCAR in the 2000s up to present day is a very refined product. Look, it's still racing, but it doesn't quite have that hard edge that it did back in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. The drivers, the cars, and the experience is much different than it was back in its early days, where it was kind of a bare knuckle brawl. Now it's more of a ballet of sorts. So NASCAR today, look, it's widely watched. It has a huge audience base, not just here, but everywhere. And NASCAR, it's hard to argue with the formula. Bill France Sr., Big Bill, if you will, had a vision for the wild, wild west of racing, and he made it his own. Guys, I appreciate you watching this video, and if you have a classic American muscle car or truck, you need parts, you want to restore it, you want to make it go faster, check us out at First Place Auto Parts, simply at fpautoparts.com. There you will find everything you need. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you have any comments, please leave them at the bottom of the screen. We appreciate you watching, and until next time, keep the hammer down and keep it between the guardrails.